through 41. They should be up on the screen. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This is the word of God.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you as well to Ben for guys leading worship for us with Pablo out this Sunday, doing a beautiful job of that. Friends, it's great to be with you this morning. My name is Charlie Dunn, and if you've been with us for the last couple of months now, we've been in this teaching series called The Questions Jesus Asks. Jesus was a master question asker. He was constantly asking questions of people as a way to draw them out, to engage them in conversation and relationship with him. Jesus asks these questions in a way that allows people to really know him in deeper and fresher ways. And the question that we're going to look at together this morning is the question Jesus asks right at the end of this story. He says to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" And it's a question that falls within a story that might already be familiar to some of us here in this room, this story of Jesus calming the storm. It's actually a story that our kids ministry teachers taught in our toddlers class a few weeks ago. I'm so thankful, by the way, for those of you and for those in our church, about 60 people who volunteer with our kids ministry on a rotation, and they don't just provide care for these children so that their parents can go to worship, but they're teaching them. They're imparting these truths of who God is to their young hearts and minds. And a few weeks ago, our son Patton came home from the toddler class, and he had his illustration, his drawing from what he had learned in that time. They had talked about this story, Jesus calming the storm. And we asked him, we said, "Patton, what did you learn in Sunday school today?" And he gave a short little response. He said, "Jesus is amazing." And that's what they taught him. I love that. That was the one takeaway for the day. That's about as far as his theological understanding goes at this point. But that is so true. Is it not? Jesus is amazing. And especially maybe for a story that might be familiar already to some of you in this room. If I have one hope for us today, it's that you would walk away saying, "Jesus is amazing." That you would respond just like the disciples do. After this experience with Jesus, what do they say? They say, "Who is this? That even the winds and the waves obey him." That you would walk away with a fresh sense of wonder and worship and amazement toward who this Jesus is, even as you might find that the question that Jesus asks and the answer to that question helps you to face your fears, even at times to overcome them. And so I want to walk through this story together, and I want to do so by asking three questions together. Here they are. First, why are we so afraid? That's Jesus' question to the disciples. Why are you so afraid? So first, why are we so afraid? Then secondly, what are the answers that we look to, and why are these answers to our fears often insufficient? Why do they often fall short as solutions to our fear? And then thirdly, how is Jesus uniquely alone really the answer to our fears? So we'll walk through these three questions together, starting with the first. Why are we so afraid? You know that there are surveys that are done periodically where Americans are asked, what are you most afraid of? And often people will say that their greatest fear is what? Public speaking. Even more than some people would say, I'm more afraid of public speaking, even than I am afraid of death. Which led the comedian Jerry Seinfeld to once quip, whenever you go to a funeral, then that means there are some people who would rather be in the casket than getting up giving the eulogy at that funeral. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but there are all these surveys asking people, what are your top greatest fears? And the most respectable of these surveys, the most sort of researched, is one that comes from Chapman University. They put this out every year, Americans' greatest fears. And when they got the results in 2018, they noticed that something had significantly changed. So the first change was that just the list of the top 10 fears, there were a number of new fears that had never made the top 10 before. Fears about running out of clean drinking water, or some people were afraid of natural disasters and storms, political corruption, along with the other typical fears of not having enough money, fear of getting sick, fear of losing a loved one. So they noticed that there were some new fears reported, but the biggest change was that for the first time, 40% of the people who took this survey said of the top 10 fears, they were afraid of all of them. They said, yes, I identify with every single one of these 10 fears, and on the whole, those who responded to the survey said their level of fear over the past year had increased. It had intensified. In many ways, Americans were more afraid than they had ever been before. And what's striking to me about this is this was before the COVID pandemic. Right? This was 2018. This was 2 years before COVID. And you think of the way in which this pandemic increased our just level of social anxiety, of getting sick and death and job loss and isolation, all of the intensified fear that came with the COVID pandemic. And we recognize that our culture, our society today, in many ways, is deeply afraid. You're here this morning, and I'm sure there are many of us in this room, and maybe you're facing very real fears. Things that weigh heavily upon you. Our neighbors are afraid. Our coworkers are afraid. And so when Jesus asks us this question, why are you so afraid? It's a very relevant question. It's a question that hits pretty close to home. Because many of us, certainly in our society, are deeply afraid. And why is that? Why are we so afraid? Well, I think the answer in part is because we live in a scary world. We live in a world where a lot of really frightening things can happen to us. I was watching TV the other day. I saw this commercial for disability insurance, and this guy is sitting with his daughters, and one of his daughters asks him, she says, Dad, what would you do if you had to miss work for a few weeks? He says, why would I miss work? And they proceed over the next 30 seconds to list all of the potential things that could happen to him, including like scurvy. And he's like, scurvy? I'm not, but in the course of hearing all these things that could happen to him, by the end of the commercial, you know what he wants? He wants disability insurance. I want it too. You watch this commercial, you think, wow, look at all the terrible things that could happen to you. We live in a scary world. We live in a frightening world. That's certainly true of this story. Here are these disciples. They're on this boat with Jesus, and there's the storm. And it's not as if Jesus says to them, look, this is not a particularly bad storm. I know that tornado sirens all went off on Thursday. Everybody was concerned that maybe there's going to be this huge tornado or storm, but maybe you guys are getting too worked up. It's not that big of a deal. These storms happen all the time. Jesus doesn't say that to them. He doesn't say, hey, this isn't that big of a storm. What's striking is that these disciples, these guys were fishermen, meaning they were constantly out on the Sea of Galilee, and they knew that storms were a pretty regular occurrence on the Sea of Galilee. If any of you have ever been to the Sea of Galilee or you're familiar with its context, you've got Mount Hermon, which is like 10,000 feet high on one side, And then the Sea of Galilee itself is 700 feet below sea level. So you've got really cold air that's coming down from the mountains, and you've got this warm air rising up from the water. So there's a constant clash of weather systems, and so there are a lot of storms. So they very much would have been familiar with storms, but this was not your everyday kind of storm. Our translation says it was a furious squall. I don't know if I've ever used the word squall except in this sermon, but the Greek word there is a word that could be translated as hurricane. This was a hurricane force storm. This was a terrifyingly frightening storm experience for them. And I believe this storm really happened. I'll come back to that in a moment. But what you need to understand too, because I think the gospel writer Mark understands this, as he was steeped in Jewish scripture and tradition, is that in the Bible, a storm, or in the Bible, the sea, the waters of the sea, they symbolize chaos. They symbolize the unpredictable nature of our world. For the Jewish people, they were not a seafaring people. And so for them, the idea of being caught out in the sea in a storm, that was terrifying. That was a picture of the chaotic forces in the world that seemed to war against God's otherwise good order and purposes. And so in a way, this storm, and the storm that happens on the waters of this sea, it's actually a symbol, it's actually a metaphor for the human condition. That you and I, we live in a world where there are sudden storms. We live in a world that's unpredictable. We live in a world that's out of our control. I don't know, have any of you ever been to the ocean before and you start like wading out into the water and maybe it gets up to your neckline? You can't see what's underneath the water there, and all of a sudden something like slithers past your leg, and you jump, right? You're startled. You're like, that's terrifying, because you can't see what's there. At least on land, you can see what's coming for you. At least on land, you can see what might be approaching, but in the water, you don't know what's down there. You don't know what might be there lurking, waiting to get you, and all of a sudden, it can be peaceful waters, and then suddenly there's a storm. And you see, the storm and the sea, then, it's like a metaphor, it's a picture for how we live in a world where we are vulnerable, we're susceptible to unpredictable, frightening storms. And to a degree, those of us in this room, we may be more shielded from some of that chaos than other people are in other parts of the world. There are other people in the world who may be more vulnerable to chaos than we are. And yet no amount of wealth, no amount of power can ultimately shield you from the storms of life. Can shield you from loss of a job or loss of financial security. Shield you from loss of your health, a threatening diagnosis, or the loss of a loved one. And even if somehow you manage to make it through your life without facing many of these most frightening storms, eventually you're going to face the greatest storm of all. You're going to face the storm, the chaos of death itself, which is the ultimate witness to human vulnerability in our world. And so if you ask, why are we so afraid? Yeah, maybe our social fear is higher than it's been before, but the ultimate reason we're so afraid is because we live in a scary world. It's because we live in a world that's marred and that's broken because of sin, a world where all sorts of frightening things can happen to us. And so we've got to come up with some way to deal with that. We've got to come up with some way to manage and face our fears so that we can function, so that we can move forward within the world. And so we come up with these answers. We come up with solutions. And that's our second question this morning, namely, what are those answers? What are those solutions that we look to face our fear, but which ultimately fall short, which ultimately prove insufficient? And I want to suggest, I know I'm generalizing a little bit, but I want to suggest that generally speaking, there are two solutions. One, which is a more secular solution, and the other, which is a more religious solution. But both of these solutions ultimately fall short. Both are insufficient. Let me show you why. So first, there's the secular solution to dealing with our fear. And you might describe that secular solution as something like the power of positive thinking. You might see this kind of strand in a lot of pop psychology, that the way for us to handle our fear is chiefly through the power of positive thinking. Fear is something we experience mostly in our minds. So if we can get control of our mind and our thought patterns, then we can face our fears. So, maybe in the world of sports psychology, if you're playing in, the NCAA basketball tournament, March Madness, and you're afraid of getting the ball to take that shot when time is expiring at the end of the game, how do you overcome that fear so you can take that shot in that moment? Well, you imagine yourself successfully making that basket. You positively imagine yourself succeeding in that scenario, making the game-winning shot, so that when the moment comes, you'll be ready to have the confidence to do that. Or maybe imagine yourself, if you're afraid of public speaking, you've got to give a presentation at work. Imagine that talk going really well, and you nail all your points, and your coworkers are high-fiving you after the presentation. Imagine that positive outcome, and it will help you to have more confidence facing it. Or another variation on this would be if you're a little bit more rationally minded person and you're afraid of flying. Maybe just to think through all of the statistics. Okay, so how many flights take off and how many flights actually crash, and what is the likelihood that I would actually be in a plane-related death? It's very low, and so maybe that kind of intellectual process of positively thinking through that helps you to have less fear so that you can get on the plane to fly. The power of positive thinking. Now, are these techniques and methods potentially helpful? Absolutely. In fact, if they weren't, I don't think that so many writers or psychologists might encourage people to try these things. Of course, they're helpful to a degree. But the problem with the power of positive thinking to overcome our fear is that ultimately it's still superficial. It may help to some degree, but the reality is that fear is not just in our minds. What's frightening about our world is not just what's going on in our minds. What's scary about the world is out there. It's external to us. It's real, and at some point, no matter how positive you may be, reality can come crashing in on you. Or you might be the most positive person in the world, and you still get a life-threatening diagnosis. You might be incredibly positive, and yet you still get in a car wreck. Something scary, something frightening does happen to you, because what's scary about our world is not just what's going on in our minds, but it's the world itself. The external world to us is a scary place. And so that solution tends to fall short. Now, other people take a more religious approach to fear, and they think to themselves, if I believe in God, and I worship this God, and I know that this God is for me, that he's on my side, and I'm obedient, and I go to church, and I read the Bible, and I do the things that God wants me to do, then God will keep me from having to go through the really scary storms in life. He'll keep the really scary storms at bay. I might go through some storms, some little storms, but he won't let me go through the really frightening things if I'm a good religious person. But it's striking to me about this story is to think about, why did these disciples end up in this storm? Is it because they disobeyed Jesus? Is it because they disobeyed God? No. There is a story like that in the Bible. It's a story we read every single night in our home right now. Patton's favorite story is the story of Jonah. So every night he wants us to read him the story of Jonah. If you know that story, Jonah is sent to go share God's love with his enemies. He doesn't want to go. He goes in the opposite direction, so God sends a storm. And that storm, in many ways, is a judgment. It's a consequence because of Jonah's disobedience to God, even as it's a way that God is seeking to draw Jonah back to him. And so there might be a storm or a consequence, a frightening storm that happens in your life because of disobedience, because of bad behavior, as you sin against the very fabric of how God made this world. But that's not the case in this story, is it? Why did the disciples end up in this storm? Not because they disobey God, but because they obey him. Jesus says, hey, let's get in the boat. Let's go over to the other side of the lake. And they don't say, I don't know. There's a lot of storms on this lake. I'm not sure that I really want to be sailing on it right now. No, they're obedient. They get in the boat with Jesus. They're following Jesus. It's precisely because they're following Jesus that they end up in the eye of this storm. And I say that because if there's not room in the way you think about who God is, if there's not room for you to believe that this God is so much bigger than you, that he's so much wiser than you, that in his love for you, he actually may have good reasons for why he allows you to enter into really frightening storms, for why he lets you go through really scary experiences in your life for reasons that you might not recognize or see, then can I tell you, when you're in the midst of that storm, you're going to end up saying what the disciples say to Jesus in this story. What do they say to him? They wake him up and they say to Jesus, Jesus, don't you care that we are drowning? Does that question resonate with anybody in this room? You ever asked that of Jesus before? Jesus, don't you care that I'm suffering here? Don't you care that I lost my job? Don't you care that I'm sick? Don't you care that this loved one is dying? Don't you care that I'm in a really difficult marriage? Don't you care? And that will be your response to Jesus. You'll conclude that if he is a God who has any power at all, he just must not care about you. Or he's abandoned you, or he doesn't really love you. Or, and I suppose this is another way to deal with our fear, you might just give up your faith in God altogether. Might just say maybe he doesn't even exist. And actually, that's the scariest way to face your fear in the world. Because that is to say that on the one hand, you're not given in to the delusion of just thinking that fear is, faced by the power of positive thinking. You're honest about there are scary things in the world, but you are alone in it. There's no shepherd, there's no God, there's nobody looking out for you. You are alone, utterly alone in a scary world. And that's a really, really scary solution from which to try to face your fear. And so that leads us to a third question of how does Jesus then invite us to face our fear? What answer, what solution does he have for how we might be able to face our fear with him? And I want to draw our attention to really three parts to this answer that I think Jesus provides for us and how we face our fear with him in this story. Here they are. Here's the first thing. I want you to notice that Jesus' answer to our fear is grounded in the real world. Right? Some who maybe would take that last approach of saying, there's no God, there's nobody looking out for me, we are alone in a scary world. They might say, this is just wishful thinking to believe that there's this God who loves you and cares for you. But I want you to see that Jesus' answer is grounded in the real world. It's not wishful thinking. It's not pie in the sky kind of spirituality. It's not power of positive thinking. When you read through this story, I'll admit it, when you read this story and you hear, here is this guy who is so tired from a day of preaching that he has to sleep. And yet when he wakes up, he simply speaks. And the storm is stilled. And the water is calm. I mean, if you've ever even been to a beach before and you've seen a big storm over the ocean, you know, even when that storm ends, it's going to be like days where the waves are still rolling before the sea is calm. And you may read this and you may think to yourself, this guy just speaks and it's calm? Doesn't that sound like myth? Doesn't that sound like legend? Are we to really believe that this really happened in this real world in which you and I live today? And I'll tell you, one of the things that was really helpful to me is to read, there's a guy named Richard Bauckham. He's a great New Testament scholar. He wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. One of the things that he points out is he says, this is a really short story, 150 words, not a very long story. But he says in the course of this story, what you have is you have these little details. And these details, they don't really seem to contribute at all to the development of the plot line in the story. And you have to remember, 2,000 years ago, they didn't have like our modern realistic historical fiction where you're going to incorporate these details in a myth or in a fable. He says, but you've got these little details. Like we're told that Jesus got into the boat as he was, meaning he'd been in a boat preaching all day, and then instead of getting out of the boat, instead of going off to clean up or grab something or eat some food or something, he just, as he was in the boat, he went off to the other side. Or we're told that there were other boats there in the water with them. Or we're told that when Jesus went to sleep, he wasn't just asleep, but he was asleep with his head on a cushion. And Bauckham points out, he says, these little details that are included in this story, what are these? He says, these are the marks of a memory. These are the kinds of details that you see in an eyewitness testimony. That what we have here is not a myth or a fable. It is an eyewitness account of an event in time that really happened in this very real world in which you and I still live today. But then secondly, notice with me, not only is this answer to our fear grounded in the real world, but notice with me that it's grounded in a person. It's grounded in who this Jesus is. You know, there are only two kinds of people who sleep through a hurricane, who sleep through a major storm. One is somebody who is so checked out to the world, like maybe Jonah, totally checked out to the world, but the other is somebody who is totally in control of the world. And that's Jesus. They wake Jesus up. He gets up and he speaks. He just says, quiet down, be still. And it's still. Storm ceases, the waters are completely calm. And that's incredible. I mean, our scripture reader, after the greeting time, can't even say that to calm down and get our congregation to quiet down and sit down in worship. And yet here Jesus simply speaks, and it's calm. It's incredible. Who has that kind of power? And you see, as Jesus does this, as he speaks in this way, and it's calm, it begins to dawn on the disciples. The penny begins to drop for them. Who is this? Who is able to speak and to calm the sea in this way? You know, there's a Danish legend. Apparently there was this 12th century Danish king who was getting irritated because his subjects were just constantly fawning over him, fairly humble guy. And so he decided one day, he said, you know what we're going to do is we're going to take my throne down to the beach. And so they did that, and he sat there on his throne as the waves were rolling in, and he put up his hands and he said, be still. And you know what happened? The next wave just came right up over him, soaked half of his body, and he got up and he took his crown and he put it on a crucifix. And he said, from henceforward, the only person who is worthy of the title of king is the one whom heaven and earth and the sea obey. Jesus speaks, and it's calm. Because the man in the boat with them, who a moment ago was so tired that he was asleep, is none other than the creator of the heavens and the earth and the sea. And he has the power to still creation itself. And you see, friends, the reason why this begins to be a solution to our fear, to see that Jesus is bigger than the storm, to see that Jesus is more powerful than the storm. The reason why this begins to be a solution to our fear is because when we are afraid, instinctively, intuitively, fear looks to a person. Fear looks for a powerful person. Fear looks for somebody who has the power and the authority to make me feel safe in my frightening situation. So if you have kids, if you have children, and they wake up with a nightmare in the middle of the night, I don't think they're going through the power of positive thinking, right? They're not going through their fear exercises and journaling and trying to manage their fearful thoughts. They're getting up and they're running to mom and dad. They're running to a safe person, somebody who makes them feel safe in the midst of that frightening situation. If your bank is Silicon Valley Bank and your bank fails, you're running to the Secretary of the Treasury. You're running to the President of the United States. You're looking, somebody who has power, somebody who has authority to address my scary situation. If you've got a medical operation that you're facing, I know some of you have had medical operations. I know my dad had one on his heart on Thursday. You've got a medical operation that you're facing, and afterwards the doctor says to you, you're going to be okay. You know how comforting, you know how reassuring that is to you. Because the authority that you vest in that doctor, you think, here's somebody who has authority, who has power towards my scary situation. Fear looks to a powerful person. Innately, instinctively, we want somebody who's powerful, somebody who has the authority over what is causing our fear. And you see the answer to our fear that we see in this story, that we're given in this story, is not that if you follow Jesus, he won't let any frightening storms come into your life. Now, the answer is that Jesus is bigger than those storms. The answer is that Jesus is more powerful than those storms. The answer is that if you ground your life in this Jesus, if you are united to this Jesus, if your life is bound up with his life, if Jesus is with you in the boat, there is no wave, there is no storm that can ultimately sink you, that you are safe in him. Jesus has power over every force in the world that could threaten to undo us. You see it in the Gospels. He has power over the demons. He has power over sickness. He has power over disease. He has power over guilt. He has power over shame. He has power even over the forces of nature. And at the end of Jesus' life, you know what happens? Jesus is thrown into the greatest storm of all. He's thrown into the chaos, the storm of death itself. And yet he rises up from the dead and he looks at even death and he says, quiet down. Jesus has power over every force that could threaten to undo us. And if you know that he loves you, if you know that he cares for you, no matter what storm you might be facing, you're ultimately safe if he's in the boat with you. But then the last thing for us to see is, thirdly, it's not enough just to affirm that's true. To sit here on a Sunday morning and say, yeah, I believe that Jesus is God himself in the flesh. I believe he is bigger and badder than any storm I could face, that he has power over all things, and that if he is with me and for me, then I am ultimately safe in him. It's not enough simply to affirm that that's true. You got to learn to use what you know to be true. You got to learn to draw upon that faith. You've got to learn to exercise that faith when you find yourself in really frightening situations. Now, Jesus asks this question of his disciples. He says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Another translation for that second question is, where is your faith? That's the translation in Luke chapter 8, a similar account of this story. Where is your faith? In other words, what Jesus is saying is faith is not an automatic kind of response. When you're in the midst of a scary situation, faith is not an automatic response. And it's not as if there are just like some people who have faith and other people don't. Gosh, I wish I had more faith. I wish I was the kind of person who could have faith. I don't. I'm an anxious kind of person. It's not as if some people just have faith and other people don't. Jesus is saying, no, you've got to use your faith. You have to learn to exercise your faith. It's like a muscle. You've got to learn to put that faith into practice when those frightening storms come into your life. Meaning, do you know how to fight your fears and your feelings of fear with your faith? Do you know how to fight those feelings of fear? To say those feelings of fear, they're actually not telling me everything I need to know about this situation. To be able to say to those feelings, even if I feel alone, it doesn't mean that I'm alone. Even if my life feels like chaos, doesn't mean that it's chaos. Even if I feel like God has abandoned me, it doesn't mean he has abandoned me. To be able to take the truth of what you know about who Jesus is and to fight those feelings of fear with that, to say, no, Jesus has power over everything. He's with me. He's for me. He loves me. He's in my boat. He's committed himself to me. Do you know how to fight those feelings of fear with your faith? And of course, that's why we engage in these spiritual practices. That's why we come to corporate worship, to remind ourselves of what we know to be true of who Jesus is for us. That's why we read God's word and we meditate upon it, wanting to let those truths make their way into our hearts. It's why we seek to pray, to cultivate a relationship with Jesus, to rely on him in the midst of the things that would otherwise terrify us to face. We learn to exercise, to use our faith. Jesus is saying, where is your faith? Why aren't you using it? Put it into practice. And, in some ways, this is challenging, isn't it? Maybe it doesn't actually seem that tender or that sympathetic. That's something that sat with me as I wrestled with this text this week. I might expect Jesus to say something different. Like, man, I understand why you guys would be afraid. You just went through this terrifying storm on the water. Of course you were afraid. Jesus is very patient. He's very sensitive often with people in the Gospels, but you don't see that here, do you? Instead, he just says to them, do you still have no faith? Meaning what? Meaning I've given you enough evidence. Haven't you seen my power already? Haven't you seen my love for you? So that you don't need to be freaking out in this situation? Do you still not believe? Don't you know I've given you more than enough reason to trust that if I'm with you, you're going to be okay? And I think, gosh, if Jesus could say that to his disciples then, how much more could he say that to us today? Those of us who live on this side of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Those of us who know that if Jesus didn't abandon us when he was facing the greatest storm, as the judgment of God was poured out for our sin upon him, if he didn't abandon us then, how could we think he would abandon us in any other storm? If Jesus triumphed over death itself, if he rose bodily from the dead as the guarantee that one day we will rise up with him, how could we believe that anything, even death itself, could separate us from his love? Jesus is saying, you've got more than enough reason to trust that I'm with you, that I'm for you. Where is your faith? Use it, exercise it. And of course, that takes practice. It's a muscle that we have to develop and grow as we face scary situations, really frightening things in our lives. And yet ultimately, the way that we face our fear is by knowing that we have the most powerful person. We have Jesus. He's with us in our boat. And if Jesus is with you in your boat, no matter what storm you face, you ultimately are going to be okay. Why are you so afraid? Let's pray as we come to the Lord's table this morning.